Well, what an exciting evening it is. We're so delighted to have Colm Toibin with us, to read from his work and to talk with us. This is an event that is being jointly sponsored by the Irish Consulate here in Boston, and so it gives me great pleasure to introduce Marianne Bulger, who is the Vice Consul at the Consulate here. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thanks very much. Thank you for coming along this evening. Richard, thank you for providing this very elegant establishment for tonight's event. As you know, last Monday was the 17th of March, Ireland's national holiday, St. Patrick's Day, and there's celebrations around the world, especially here in Boston, that span the full month of March. And so we had Ireland's Minister with responsibility for Justice, Equality and Law Reform, Brian Lennon, here. He spent a week here in Boston and is tonight on his way back to Ireland, and so he's sorry he can't be with us. But during the visit, he took the opportunity to highlight some of the things that Ireland has to offer, and including our success from our economic and trade links to the recent and very positive advances in our peace process. He also took the opportunity to speak about the long-standing historical and cultural links with Massachusetts, which were profiled at our Day of Culture at the State House, which took place last Thursday. You may not be aware that Governor Patrick proclaimed on the 6th of March that March 2008 should be recognised as Irish Heritage Month. So as a result, we are all duty-bound to enjoy ourselves here this evening. And I can't think of a better way of fulfilling your civic obligation than by being here with someone who represents the best of what Ireland has to offer in terms of contemporary literary talent. Through his reading, Colm Toibin will reveal to us just the extent of that talent. Thank you, Colm, for being with us and take the time to read to us, and we're very honoured to have you here. There are a few people I would like to thank before I end. Monica Higgins, the Director of Events here at the Boston Athenaeum, John Connolly from the Mayor's Office of Arts, Tourism and Special Events, and Mary O'Donoghue, another talented Irish writer who is based here in Boston, who teaches at Babson College. Thank you all for your help in making tonight's event a reality. Finally, I would like to introduce James Smith. Since 2000, Jim, who I know him as Jim, has been a member of faculty at the Department of English and Irish Studies programme, which forms part of the Centre for Irish Programmes at Boston College, one of the largest Irish study programmes in the US. In 2007, he became Associate Professor, and last month I had the privilege of introducing Jim's new and compelling book, which is entitled The Magdalen Laundries and the Nation's Architecture of Containment, which is available here in the US through the University of Notre Dame Press. I would like to ask Jim to come up to welcome Colm Toibin, and I hope you all have a very, very enjoyable evening. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm especially pleased to welcome Colm Toibin back to Boston, having helped host him at BC on a number of occasions. I can assure you that we are all in for a very special treat tonight. Colm Toibin is the foremost Irish writer of his generation, a novelist of international reputation, critically acclaimed at home and abroad, and highly regarded by general and academic readers alike. He is best known because of his 5 novels he has written to date, most recently The Master in 2004, a novel examining the life of Henry James, perhaps the greatest of all American writers, and himself no stranger to Boston. Winner of the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and the International IMPAC Dublin Literary Award, Michael Cunningham, author of The Hours, called The Master, and I quote, a remarkable, utterly original book. Edmund White added that, quote, nothing about this book feels piecemeal or improvised. It is a sustained performance, worthy of the master. Colm's earlier novels include The South, 1990, The Heather Blazing, 1992, The Story of the Night, 1996, and The Blackwater Lightship, 1999. Each of these novels, in their turn, was well received, each of them the recipient of numerous awards, including the Irish Times Aer Lingus First Novel Prize for The South, the E.M. Forster Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters for The Heather Blazing, and the Pharaoh Grumley Prize for the Best Gay Novel for Story of the Night. Colm's fiction has twice been shortlisted for the Man Booker Prize, as it was for the Whitbread First Novel Award. As a writer, however, Colm has shown himself unbound by any single genre. Indeed, his literary and cultural criticism, non-fiction prose, journalism, and work as an editor cohere to make him one of Ireland's foremost public intellectuals. His non-fiction titles include Love in a Dark Time, Gay Lives from Wilde to Almodovar, 2002, Lady Gregory's Toothbrush, 2002, and Homage to Barcelona, 1990. He edited, among others, The Penguin Guide of Irish Fiction, 1999, and Soho Square 6, New Writing from Ireland, 1997. Likewise, he wrote introductions to the Irish Times Book of Favourite Irish Poems and to Blacklist Section H, Francis Stewart's important and long overlooked novel. Born in Enniscorthy, County Wexford, in Ireland in 1955, Colm Toibin was educated at University College Dublin, where he read English and history. After graduation, he lived and taught in Barcelona in Spain before returning to Ireland, where he worked as a journalist, writing with courage and discerning critical insight about an array of corporate, political and social scandals, among other topics. Colm has served as a Stein Visiting Writer at Stanford University, as a visiting writer at the Michener Center at the University of Austin, Texas, University of Texas, Austin, and as a fellow at the Center for Scholars and Writers at New York Public Library. He is also a member of ESTONA, the state-funded affiliation of creative artists recognised by their peers for contributions to the arts in Ireland. Colm Toibin lives in Ireland, but his writing and research sees him travelling across the globe. In conclusion, and more pertinent to tonight's reading, Colm Toibin's first collection of short stories, Mothers and Sons, was published in 2007. This past January, the book was released in paperback here in the US. Turning to a genre long associated with Irish writers, including Frank O'Connor, Sean O'Phelan and Mary Lavin, Colm's achievement is already well noted in the book's critical reception. When I taught a graduate seminar in contemporary Irish fiction last fall, my students voted it their favourite text, and in a group of 14 students, 4 would go on to write their concluding seminar paper on issues represented in Colm's work. With that as one kind of validation, I will conclude with another, the affirmation of a fellow writer reviewing Colm's work for the New York Times. Pico Iyer ended his review with the following appraisal, and I quote, "The short story is a craftsman's form, and Toibin's craft is immaculate. Not many writers in Britain and Ireland are working at this level of intensity and seriousness, with not a slack sentence in 270 pages, and nothing shoddy or easily sardonic throughout. The short story also seems an ideal form for a writer much more interested in emotion and the slow exposing of a character than in action or community. Most books so full of artful sentences run the danger of being stage-managed performances. Toibin, however, never stints on feeling. Behind his impeccable sentences and silences, something is raging to get out. With that, I ask you to please join me in welcoming Colm Toibin."
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Jim. Thank you. Thank you very much. I was a bit surprised when I came to Boston for the first time, which must be now certainly about 15 years ago, because when I was 8 years old in the month of June of 1963, my father took me out of school for the day, and my father was a teacher, and his holidays came, he was a secondary teacher, his holidays came earlier, so he was already free, and we went to Wexford town, and we stood with the crowd, and we watched John Fitzgerald Kennedy coming around the corner in an open-top car, and he was the most glamorous person I'd ever seen, the suntan was so deep that no one in Ireland, people in Ireland get red and then they peel and then they get white again. But this was astonishing. It may have had some, but anyway, he was extraordinary, and he went on after that to, he visited, as well as speaking in the Dáil to the joint houses of the Oireachtas, and he went to Áras an Uachtaráin, to where the president lives, and he went to visit Eamon de Valera. And there was a wonderful moment where he said to de Valera, if things had been different since you were born in the United States and since my family came from County Wexford, if things had been different, I would be president here and you could be president in the United States. And for everyone in Ireland, de Valera was very old then, and for everyone in Ireland, the idea of having this glamorous young man as our president and you having this, de Valera, no, de Valera came in many guises, but by this time, if you were young, he seemed very old-fashioned. In the United States, would have seemed like a very interesting bargain. Just shortly before he died, I interviewed Arthur Schlesinger last year about Kennedy's visit to Ireland, and he told me something astonishing. He told me that Kennedy and some of Kennedy's entourage, including Schlesinger himself, were concerned about the censorship of books in Ireland, which was still in place in 1963. It really went in 3 or 4 years after that. And they were particularly concerned at the status of James Joyce in Ireland in 1963. It's a funny thing. It's a wonderful idea that a president of the United States would be concerned about something like that. It's a great. I think it's a great tribute to Kennedy that these things mattered to him, and that he was worried that Irish people thought that Joyce's writing was, Joyce had written dirty books. That's the phrase Schlesinger used. In Ireland, it seemed people thought that Joyce wrote dirty books and that he wasn't, one of the most important writers of the 20th century. So that they inserted into Kennedy's speech to the joint houses of the Oireachtas, in other words, to the equivalent of the joint houses of Congress, they inserted into Kennedy's speech very deliberately a reference to Joyce as a very great Irish writer, as someone Ireland should be proud of. And I went and checked when I went home, and it is in the speech. It was absolutely right. So it's just an important moment in the sort of way in which cultures cross between here and there, that was put into that speech. There are some other beautiful ones that coming here just in these streets. It's very hard not to think about Robert Lowell. And looking at Hooker's statue, the great poem Christmas Eve under Hooker's statue, the cannon on the common cannot stun the blundering butcher as he rides on time. And it says, I am cold, I ask for bread, my father gives me mold. And again with Lowell, once Lowell, that Lowell ended up living in Castletown House in County Kildare in Ireland. And that if you study carefully the cross-references between the work of Robert Lowell and Seamus Heaney, you will find a great sort of enriching between the two almost. Heaney's beautiful review of Lowell's last book, Day by Day, but also in certain moments in Heaney's diction. The friendship between the two of them, I think, was a terribly important and enriching friendship for Seamus Heaney and for Irish poetry. And then, of course, just out there, if you pass by San Gaden's statue to Colonel Shaw, it's impossible not to think of the Jameses. The statue was unveiled in 1897 by William James, and it was a statue to the Massachusetts 54th, and who were the African-American regiment who went to fight in the American Civil War. And Henry James's two younger brothers, Wilkie James and Bob James, both fought with that regiment. Wilkie James was very badly injured, and they both fought under Colonel Shaw. Colonel Shaw, who we also know, of course, from Robert Lowell's poem For the Union Dead, lean as a greyhound out there. And that just an important moment was that when William James was to unveil the statue, he and Booker Washington was to come to be in the city. James, and it was considered then an important moment, invited Booker Washington to come and stay with him in his home, Washington declined, but nonetheless the invitation was considered interesting and important. And it's terribly important for all of us, especially in the week where we've listened to an important statement about race in America, which stretches to whole ideas of race everywhere, really, to remember our own particular racial issues in Ireland, and to particularly remember, since this is also the week when we are thinking about Ireland, we began with St. Patrick's Day, to remember very much just how gnarled our own heritage is and how interesting our own heritage is. That it may seem strange now to find that the pair we now just call the Chuckle brothers, meaning Ian Paisley and Martin McGuinness, they smile so much, they grin so much that everyone now calls them the Chuckle brothers. And if anything is on, they say, will the Chuckle brothers be there? And the Chuckle brothers will be there. That I went to a lecture by Professor Kirby Miller, who is really the expert on the demographics of the Irish diaspora, who explained very carefully that for a good number of years in the 19th century, Presbyterian immigration from Ulster and Catholic immigration from Ulster formed the same patterns. And if you compare them with the Church of Ireland, that they stand on one side as a pattern, and the Church of Ireland on the other. In other words, members of the Church of Ireland tended to stay home, but it was the Presbyterians who left, and it was the Catholics who left. And among the Presbyterians who left was William James and Henry James's grandfather, William James of Albany and Baileyburgh, County Cavan. And he arrived in the United States in the early years, sometime around 1800. And one of his closest friends, as he began to make his fortune in the United States, was Thomas Addis Emmet, who was the brother of Robert Emmet, who had led the rebellion in 1802. And they remained firm friends. And it's an interesting thing to remember about that early Presbyterian immigration from Ulster, that while it has been lost in certain ways in the way we represent Irish America, that it was terribly important, and that great numbers of those people left Ireland in search of various freedoms, including religious freedom. And so much so, indeed, that Henry James's father knew Robert Emmet's speech from the dock off by heart and often recited it. And so close did the two families remain into the next generation that three of Henry James's first cousins married three Emmets. And when it went down to the next generation, who included the painter Bay Emmet, and they would visit Henry James in England, he would write to somebody, "The Emmetry are arriving," he would say. And that it's not insignificant here that this idea of coming to America in search of certain freedoms fed its way within the James family to the idea of abolition and to the opposition to slavery. And that had its roots somewhere in County Cavan in the late 18th century, which would have made its way into the rebellion of 1798, into the pamphlets written in 1798 about various aspects of freedom, that it would have made its way into Henry James's father taking a very firm view on this, as did his friends, enough so that he'd sent his two younger sons to a special school where John Brown's children were, where the children of Emerson were. And it was in that school that those two sons, Wilkie James and Bob James, became fired up with the idea that this battle against slavery was a really important battle to fight in America, and that somehow made its way from Ulster in a very roundabout way, but so that the connections between Ireland and Boston come in many strange ways, not only in the let's say the things that we are very well known for in Boston, and perhaps that which includes maybe the certain traditions within the Democratic Party, but also in other ways which have been perhaps the Irish aspect of them have been perhaps forgotten about. One of the problems that faces anyone now who is writing fiction is the problem of fact, and is the problem that as things change in countries, there is pressure, and there always really has been, on novelists to reflect that change. And that if you want to say, I wish to write about the human heart, there's always someone wishing to tell you, well, why don't you write about the human heart in the next book, but write about 9/11 in the next, in the one you're currently working on. And I've had this argument with my friend Frank McCourt over the fact that how could you, in the very years when Ireland was really changing, when the possibility of a real and lasting settlement was coming in Northern Ireland, and when the economic conditions in the South had changed so fundamentally that we had not only full employment, but people actually emigrating to Ireland for the first time in search of work and finding work, including perhaps more than 100,000 Polish people and great numbers of Chinese and Nigerians, that how could you waste your time, and our time indeed, writing a novel about Henry James? Surely of all the issues that was most facing the Irish people in terms of the need for people to have images of their society handed to them, to have sort of mirrors put up to who they are, surely this was the last thing that was needed. Where is your novel? Where is your novel about what's going on now? And it's a really hard argument to face. It's a hard argument to deal with, to say, well, you can really only write about what occurs to you. You can't write to an agenda. But at the same time, you find that in England, someone like Ian McEwan is writing almost at the top of his form very much about current events. In the United States, Philip Roth, over a number of novels, is doing the same thing. And it would be hard if someone asked you, could you give me the equivalent figure in Ireland who in book after book is describing what the great changes are north and south? And I thought about the fact that Henry James's brother Wilkie was injured in that very assault on which Colonel Shaw was killed, the assault on Fort Wagner, and that he arrived back home and he was so weak he couldn't even be moved from the hallway of the family home in Newport, and that James was upstairs. Now, James, I should say, was upstairs reading French novels, and I presume he came down regularly, but I have no idea what he saw, what he thought. There was his father had collected the Revue du Monde, and he was fascinated by the essays of Sainte-Beuve and other such figures. He hadn't gone to fight in the war himself, nor had his older brother William. But that as a writer, if you look at his early work, he begins as a short story writer, and the short stories are set during or in the aftermath of the American Civil War. And in one of them, he apologizes to the reader. He says, please forgive me for not describing the battlefield. And it's hard to imagine James on a battlefield. I mean, James in a uniform, or James even getting up in the morning and marching along with other people, that it might have been the making of him, but it would have been the making of a different sort of person than the person that we know and we need so much in certain ways. But anyway, he apologizes and says, that I wish to describe the reverse side of the picture, that he didn't want to deal directly with the battlefields, but more what happened to people who stayed at home, what happened to sweethearts, what happened to mothers, what happened to survivors, so that he dealt with it from an oblique angle. And it's a pity, when I was talking to Frank McCourt about this, I didn't think of that at the time. It was an esprit d'escalier, that later on, as I was walking along the street one day, I said, I wish I'd remembered that. I could have said that to him in explanation that there are certain times when you have to remember that as a writer of fiction or as an artist, that you really have no responsibilities at all other than responsibilities to your sentences. And your job is to see if you get your sentences right. But you don't really have any other responsibilities except maybe to your readers. But then if you started thinking about that when you're writing your sentences, that's such a large idea, responsibilities to readers, that it would ruin your sentence. So that they are, judges often have to decide if there are two rights, which of them is the primary one. Well, I think the sentences really is the one that wins out there. So that I think you just have to concentrate on your sentences and remember that you have no other responsibilities, but you have plenty of rights, almost infinite rights, really. This might be disturbing for your family if you end up writing about them or your friends or even for yourself, indeed. But nonetheless, it's an important thing to remember and to write up almost in front of you as you're writing. A, get on with your sentences. B, no other responsibilities. C, plenty of rights. I went, when I was 15, to a school called St. Peter's College, Wexford. It was a diocesan boarding school. It was run by the Diocese of Ferns. There were 300 of us on what we called the lay side. There was also a seminary on the other side, and some people from the lay side ended up in the seminary. And the seminarians were in charge of us in many ways on the dormitories or in the study hall. It was an interesting school because I'd come from the Christian Brothers, and it was like coming from the 50s into the 60s, because the priests who were teaching us, because they had the summers free, they spent the summers in the United States working in parishes, and they came home to Ireland with the news from America. And it's important to remember what the news from America was like, in 1970, that it was really about what had happened as a result of the civil rights movement, that it was about the women's movement, that it was about arguments being made about church and state, that it was about protest. And that even though America was at war in 1970, nonetheless, if somebody was spending a summer in an American parish and coming home to tell you about it, it was about the new rights that people were seeking in America and the new language that was being used for the seeking of those rights. It was an interesting place to be. Everything was open for discussion. Oddly enough, it didn't even occur to me at the time that homosexuality wasn't, but it's because nobody ever mentioned it or thought of it. It just wasn't there. It just didn't exist as a concept. Even as an insult, as a term you could use of abuse, it didn't even exist. It was just not there. Of course, it was everywhere. It was all around us, as we later learned, because a good number of the priests got into trouble in the 1990s, in exactly the same way as happened here in the Catholic Church. And a good number of the people who had been in the seminary did too. And that became a terribly interesting story, which preoccupied people in Ireland greatly in the 1990s, the image of somebody who had been such a figure of authority, such a respected figure, being that image of a priest being led out in handcuffs with an anorak over his head on the 6 o'clock news was something that really shocked people, and I think changed things in Ireland very much. And if you're a novelist, and since I had known some of these men, this seemed to me a subject that worthy of a novel. And I noticed that my friend Andrew Hagan eventually did write a novel about it, a novel called Be Near Me. But when I started the novel, it was a novel about somebody like me, but he was from a farm, and he was sent to the school, and he existed in the school more or less as I did, being friends with some of the priests, knowing the corridors, knowing all that world very well. And then 25 years later, this is Ireland in something like 1995, and this would not be unusual in Ireland in 1995, that he would be living with his boyfriend back on the farm. His mother would be living nearby, and on a Saturday night the priest would come, the priest that he'd been friends with in school, his English teacher, or a teacher like that, and that the four of them would play bridge together, drink some drinks, have supper together, and have a lovely time together, the four of them. And I had it in my head that as an image of the society, the two gay men sort of happily on the farm, the mother, the priest, all of them playing bridge. And then one night, as the priest is going out the door, he says to him, you mentioned once before that when you were in college, you had a friend who's become a really good lawyer. Could you give me his name? I'm going to need a lawyer. And the guy realizing why. And then it unfolding what had actually been happening in the school in front of everyone's nose that everyone didn't notice. And the problem was that the novel didn't work. And the only way you can tell a novel is not working is by reading it yourself. Other people are often no use to you because they'll always tell you that something is good or it's fine or keep on working or something. But luckily I read over the first few chapters and there was something dead in them. It was like that I was using only memory, that I had nothing else going in it, that I was using the deadness of memory. Or I was using even what we might call the thinness of life. And there was nothing was being lifted out of itself. There was nothing I could do. There was nothing in what I was creating that wasn't on the news. It wasn't in the newspapers. And so I stopped the book, and I wrote another book. So these are my glasses. They're not broken. They're just... I tell you what they are. They're just the future. I mean, soon everyone will have these, and I just happen to have them now. But they'll come. And it won't be long. So, what I was looking for was the Jamesian thing, the reverse side of the picture. Some aspect of that story about the priesthood in Ireland, what happened in the 1990s, that a journalist couldn't tell, that would be missing somehow from the 6 o'clock news. A figure trying to look at the photographs or the reports and think, is there anything in this? And it's funny the way this works, because sometimes something comes to you as an image rather than as an idea. I had an image of a priest visiting a woman, and you know the way when silence comes, there's a certain sort of man, I could do it myself even, you don't know what to do, so you pull up one of your socks, and then you look down, you pull up the other, and I just had that as an image, It's an image from home very much, that somebody would be sitting there and they'd do that, And anyway, this story is called A Priest in the Family. And in Wexford, where I'm from, I suppose it would belong to the 50s or early, but I heard it said anyway that a definition of respectability in this society was to have three things: to have a bull in the field, a well in the yard, and a priest in the family. And the woman through whose eyes it's told is called Molly, and she's in her late 70s, and she's a widow. And she's visited by a priest, and he's called Father Greenwood, but he's not the priest in the family. Her son, Molly's son, is a priest. He's called Frank. And Molly has two daughters called Margaret and Eileen. And this, this is a piece of fiction. But nonetheless, the streets named are very much the streets of Enniscorthy. Anyone here from Enniscorthy will recognize that if you go down there, you end up over there. But it is, at the same time, a piece of fiction. It is a way of trying to look at a public event and seeing if there was something in the reverse side of the picture that you could work with. She watched the sky darken, threatening rain. There's no light at all these days, she said. It's been the darkest winter. I hate the rain or the cold, but I don't mind it when there's no light. Father Greenwood sighed and glanced at the window. Most people hate the winter, he said. She could think of nothing more to say and hoped that he might go now. Instead, he reached down and pulled up one of his grey socks, then waited for a moment before he inspected the other and pulled that up too. Have you seen Frank lately? He asked. Once or twice since Christmas, she said. He has too much parish work to come and visit me very much, and maybe that's the way it should be. It would be terrible if it was the other way around, if he saw his mother more than his parishioners. He prays for me, I know that, and I would pray for him too, if I believed in prayer, but I'm not sure I do. But we've talked about that. You know all that. Your whole life's a prayer, Molly, Father Greenwood said, and smiled warmly. She shook her head in disbelief. Years ago, the old women spent their lives praying. Now we get our hair done and play bridge and go to Dublin on the free travel, and we say what we like. But I have to be careful what I say in front of Frank. He's very holy. He got that from his father. It's nice having a son, a priest, who's very holy. He's one of the old school. But I can say what I like to you. There are many ways of being holy, Father Greenwood said. In my time, there was only one, she replied. When he had gone, she got the RT guide and opened it for the evening's television listings. She began to set the video to record Glenroe. She worked slowly, concentrating. In the morning, When the Irish Times had been read, she would put her feet up and watch this latest episode. Now, in the hour she had to spare before she went out to play bridge, she sat at the dining room table and flicked through the newspaper, examining headlines and photographs, but reading nothing and not even thinking, letting the time pass easily. It was only when she went to fetch her coat in the small room off the kitchen that she noticed Father Greenwood's car still in front of the house. As she peered out, she could see him sitting in the driver's seat. Her first thought was that he was blocking her car and she would have to ask him to move. Later, that first thought would stay with her as a strange and innocent way of keeping all other thoughts at a distance. It was something which almost made her smile when she remembered it. He opened the car door as soon as she appeared, with her coat held distractedly over her arm. Is there something wrong? Is it one of the girls? She asked. No, he said. No, there's not. He moved towards her, preparing to make his way back into the house. She wished in the second they locked eyes that she could escape now to an evening of cards and company, get by him quickly and walk to the bridge club at the hotel, if she had to. Anything, she thought, to stop him saying whatever it was he'd come to say. Oh, it's not the boys. Oh, don't say it's the boys have had an accident and you're afraid to tell me, she said. He shook his head with certainty. No, Molly, not at all. No accidents. As he reached her, he caught her hand as though she would need his support nonetheless. I know you have to go and play bridge, he said. She believed then that it could not be anything urgent or important. If she could still play bridge, then clearly no one was dead or injured. I have a few minutes, she said. Maybe I can come back another time, he said. We can talk more. Are you in any trouble? She asked. He looked at her as though the question puzzled him. No, he said. She put her coat down on a chair in the hallway. No, he said again, his voice quieter. Then we'll leave it for another time, she said calmly and smiled as best she could. She watched him hesitate and she became even more determined that she would go immediately. She picked up her coat and made sure the keys were in the pocket. If it can wait, then it can wait, she said. He turned away from her, walking out of the hallway towards his car. Right you be, he said. Enjoy your night. I hope I didn't alarm you. She was already moving away from him, her car keys in her hand, having closed the front door firmly behind her. The next day, when she'd finished her lunch, she took her umbrella and her raincoat and walked to the library on the back road. It would be quiet, she knew, and Miriam, the new girl, would have time for her, she hoped. There was already a molly@hotmail.com, Miriam had told her on her last visit to learn how to use the library computer. So for her first email address, she would need to add something to the word Molly to make it original, like a number maybe, hers alone. Can I be Molly 80? She asked. Are you 80, Mrs. O'Neill? Not yet, but it won't be long. Well, you don't look it. Her fingers had stiffened with age, but her typing was as accurate and fast as when she was 20. If I could just type, I'd be fine, she said now, as Miriam moved an office chair close to the computer and sat beside her. That mouse will be the end of me. It doesn't do what I want it to do at all. My grandsons can make it do whatever they want. I hate having to click. Much simpler in my day, just typing, no clicking. Oh, when you're sending emails and getting them, you'll see the value of it, Miriam said. Yes, I told them I was going to send them an email as soon as I could. I'll have to think of what to put into it. She turned her head when she heard voices and saw two women from the town returning books to the library. They were studying her with immense curiosity. Look at you, Molly. You've gone all modern, one of them said. You have to keep up with what's going on, she said. You never liked missing anything, Molly. You'll get all the news from that now. She faced the computer and began to practice opening her Hotmail account as Miriam went to attend to the women. And she did not turn again when she heard them browsing among the stacks of books, speaking to one another in hushed voices. Later, when she felt she had used enough of Miriam's patience, she walked towards the cathedral and down Main Street into Irish Street. She greeted people she met on the street by name, people she had known all of her life, the children of her contemporaries, many of them grown middle-aged themselves, and even their children, all familiar to her. There was no need to stop and talk to them. She knew all about them, and they about her. When news spread widely that she was learning how to use the computer in the library, one or two of them would ask her how it was going, but for the moment she would be allowed to pass with a kind, brisk greeting. Her sister-in-law sat in the front room of her house where the fire was lighting. Molly tapped on the window and then waited while Jane fumbled with the automatic system. "Push now!" She could hear her voice through the intercom. She pushed the door, which was stiff, and having closed it behind her, let herself into Jane's sitting room. "I look forward to Monday," Jane said. "When you come down, it's lovely to see you." "It's cold outside, Jane," she said, "but it's nice and warm in here, thank God." It would be easier, more relaxing somehow, she thought, if one of them made tea. But Jane was too frail to move very much and too proud to want her sister-in-law in her kitchen. They sat opposite each other as Jane tended the fire, almost absent-mindedly. There was, she thought, nothing to say, and yet there would never be a moment's silence between them. "How was the bridge?" Jane asked. "I'm getting worse at it," Molly replied, "but I'm not as bad as some of them." "You were always a great card player. But for bridge you have to remember all the rules and the right bids, and I'm too old. But I enjoy it, and then I enjoy when it's over." "It's a wonder the girls don't play," Jane said. "When you have young children, you've enough to think about. They never have a minute." Jane nodded distractedly and looked into the fire. "They're very good, the girls," she said. "I love it when they come down to see me." "You know, Jane," Molly replied, "I like seeing them and all that, but I wouldn't care if they didn't visit from one end of the week to the next. I'm one of those mothers who prefers her grandchildren to her children." "Oh, now," Jane replied, "it's true, Jane. I'd go mad if a week went by and my lovely grandsons didn't come on a Wednesday for their tea. And I'm always raging when their mothers come to collect them. I always want to keep the boys." "They're nice when they're at that age," Jane said, "and it's so handy that they live so close together and they get on so well." "Has Frank been here?" Molly asked. Jane glanced up at her, almost alarmed. For a moment, a look of pain came on her face. "Oh, Lord, no," she said. "I haven't seen him much since Christmas either," Molly said, "but you usually know more about him. You read the parish newsletter. He gave up sending it to me." Jane bowed her head as though searching for something on the floor. "I must tell him to call in to you," Molly said. "I don't mind him neglecting his mother, but neglecting his aunt, and she the holiest one in the family." "Oh, don't now," Jane said. "I will, Jane. I'll write him a note. There's no point in ringing him. You only get that machine. I hate talking into those machines." She studied Jane across the room, aware now that all the time her sister-in-law spent alone in this house was changing her face, making her responses slower, her jaw set. Her eyes had lost their kind glow. "I keep telling you," she said as she stood up to go, "that you should get a video machine. It would be great company. I could bring you down videos." She noticed Jane taking rosary beads from a small purse and wondered if this were being done deliberately as a way of showing that she had more important things to consider. "Think about it anyway," she said. "I will, Molly. I'll think about it," Jane replied. Darkness was falling as she approached her bungalow, but she could clearly make out Father Greenwood's car parked again in front of her car. She realized that he would have seen her in one of the mirrors just as soon as she saw him. So there would be no point in turning back. If I were not a widow, she thought, he would not do this to me. He would telephone first, minding his manners. Father Greenwood got out of the car as she came close. "Now, Father Greenwood, come in," she said. "I have the key here in my hand." She brandished the key as though it were a foreign object. She'd put the heating system on a timer so the radiators were already warm. She touched the radiator in the hallway for a moment and thought of taking him into the sitting room, but felt then that the kitchen would be easier. She could stand up and make herself busy if she did not want to sit listening to him. In the sitting room, she would be trapped with him. "Molly, you must think it's strange my coming back like this," Father Greenwood said. He sat down at the kitchen table. She did not answer. She sat down opposite him and unbuttoned her coat. It struck her for a moment that it might be the anniversary of Morris's death and that he'd come to be with her in case she needed his support and sympathy. But she then remembered just as quickly that Morris had died in the summer and that he had been dead for years. and no one paid any attention to his anniversary. She could think of nothing else as she stood up and took her coat off and draped it over the armchair in the corner. Father Greenwood, she noticed, had his hands joined in front of him at the table as though ready for prayer. Whatever this was, she thought, she would make sure that he never came to her house unannounced again. Molly, Frank asked me, is there something wrong with Frank? She interrupted. Father Greenwood smiled at her weakly. He's in trouble, he said. Immediately she knew what that meant and then thought, no, her first reaction to everything else had been wrong, so maybe this too. Maybe she thought, maybe it was not what had automatically come into her mind. There's going to be a court case, Molly. Abuse. She said the word, which was daily in the newspapers and on the television, as pictures appeared of priests with their anoraks over their heads so that no one would recognize them, being led from courthouses in handcuffs. Abuse, she asked again. Father Greenwood's hands were shaking. He nodded. It's bad, Molly. In the parish, she asked. No, in the school. It was a good while ago. It was when he was teaching. Their eyes were locked in a sudden fierce hostility. Does anyone else know this? She asked. I came down to tell you yesterday, but I didn't have the heart. She held her breath for a moment and then decided she should stand up, push her chair back without caring whether it fell over, not moving her eyes from her visitor's face for 1 second. Does anyone else know this? Can you answer a straight question? It's known about, all right, Molly, Father Greenwood said gently. Do the girls know? They do, Molly. Does Jane know? The girls told her last week. Does the whole town know? It's being talked about, all right, Father Greenwood said. His tone was resigned, almost forgiving. Would you like me to make you a cup of tea? He added. I would not, thank you. He sighed. There will be a court hearing before the end of the month. They tried to have it postponed, but it looks as if it will be Thursday week. And where is Frank? He's still in his parish, but he's not going out much, as you can imagine. He abused young boys, she asked. Teenagers, he replied. And they're now grown up, is that correct? She asked. He'll need, or don't tell me what he'll need, she interrupted. It's going to be very hard for you, he said, and that's killing him. She held the side of the table with her hands. The whole town knows. Is that right? The only person who hasn't known is the old woman. You've all made a fool out of me. It was not easy to tell you, Molly. The girls tried a while ago, and I tried yesterday. And them all whispering about me, she said, and Jane with her rosary beads. I'd say people will be very kind, he said. Well, you don't know them then, she replied. He left her only when she insisted that he go. She checked the newspaper for the evening television and made her tea as though it were an ordinary Monday and she could take her ease. She put less milk than usual into the scalding tea and made herself drink it, proving to herself that she could do anything now, face anything. When a car pulled up outside, she knew that it would be the girls, her daughters. The priest would have alerted them, and they would want to come now when the news was raw, and they could arrive together so that neither of them would have to deal with her alone. Normally, they walked around the side of the house and let themselves in the kitchen door, but she moved quickly along the short corridor to the front door and turned on the light of the porch and opened the door. She stood watching them as they came towards her, her shoulders back. Come in, she said, from the cold. In the hallway, they remained for a second uneasily, unsure which room they should go into. The kitchen, she said dryly, and led the way, glad that she had left her glasses on top of the open newspaper on the table so that it would be clear to them that she had been occupied when they came. I was just going to do the crossword, she said. Are you all right? Eileen asked. She stared at her daughter blankly. It's nice to see the two of you together, she said. Are the boys well? They're fine, Eileen said. Tell them I'm nearly ready to take messages from them on an email, she said. Miriam said, one more lesson and I'll be away. Was Father Greenwood not here? Eileen asked. Margaret had begun to cry and was fumbling in her handbag looking for tissues. Eileen handed her a tissue from her pocket. Oh, yes, today and yesterday. So I have all the news. It struck her then that her grandsons would have to live with this too. Their uncle on the television and in the newspapers, their uncle the paedophile priest. At least they had a different surname, and at least Frank's parish was miles away. Margaret went to the bathroom. Don't ask me if I want tea. I don't want tea, Molly said. I don't know what to say, Eileen replied. It's the worst thing. Eileen moved across the kitchen and sat in the armchair. Have you told the boys? Molly asked. We had to tell them because we were afraid they'd hear in school. And were you not afraid I'd hear? No one would say it to you, Eileen said. You didn't have the courage, either of you. I still can't believe it, and it's going to be named and everything. Of course he's going to be named. No, we hoped he wouldn't be. He's pleading guilty. So we thought he mightn't be named, but the victims are going to ask that he be named. Is that right? Molly asked. Margaret came back into the room. Molly noticed her taking a colour brochure from her handbag. She put it on the kitchen table. We spoke to Nancy Brophy, Eileen said, and she said that she would go with you if you wanted to go to the Canaries. The weather would be gorgeous. We looked at prices and everything. It would be cheap enough, and we'd pay the flight and the hotel and everything. We thought you'd like to go. Nancy Brophy was her best friend. Did you now? Molly asked. Well, that's lovely. I look at that. I mean, when the case is on, it'll be all over the papers. It was good of you to think of it anyway, and Nancy too, Molly said and smiled. You're all very thoughtful. Would you like me to make you a cup of tea? Margaret asked. No, Margaret, she wouldn't, Eileen said. It's the boys you both should be worrying about, Molly said. No, Eileen replied. We asked them if anything had ever happened. I mean, if Frank... What? Molly asked. Had interfered with them, Margaret said. She had dried her eye and she looked at her mother bravely. Well, he hasn't. Did you ask Frank as well? Molly inquired. Yes, we did. It all happened 20 years ago. There was nothing since, he says. But it wasn't just a single episode, Margaret added, and I read that you never can tell. Well, you'll have to look after the boys, Molly said. Would you like Father Greenwood to come back and see you again? Eileen asked. I would not, Molly said. We were wondering, Margaret began. Yes, if you'd like to come and stay with one of us for a while, Margaret continued. What would I do in your house, Margaret? She asked. And sure, Eileen has no room. Or even if you wanted to go to Dublin, Eileen said. Molly went to the window and looked out at the night. They had left the parking lights on in the car. Girls, you left the lights on and the battery will be run down and one of your poor husbands will have to come and bail you out, she said. I'll go out and turn them off, Eileen said. I'm going out myself, Molly said, so we can all go. You're going out? I am, Eileen, she said. Her daughters looked at each other puzzled. But you don't usually go out on a Monday night, Eileen said. Well, I won't be able to go out until you move the car because you're blocking the drive. So you'll have to go first. But it was nice to see you. And I'll enjoy looking at the brochure. I've never been in the Canaries. She saw them signalling to each other that they could go. The town during the next week seemed almost new to her. Nothing was as familiar as she'd once supposed. She was unsure what a glance or a greeting disguised, and she was careful, once she had left her own house, never to turn too sharply or look too closely in case she saw them whispering about her. A few times, when people stopped to talk to her, she was unsure if they knew about her son's disgrace, or if they too had become so skilled at the plain language of small talk that they could conceal every thought from her, every sign, as she could from them. She made clear to her daughters that she did not wish to go on any holidays or change her routine. She played bridge on Tuesday night and Sunday night as usual. On Thursday she went to the Gramophone Society, and on Wednesday after school she was visited, as always, by her 4 grandsons, who watched videos with her and ate fish fingers and chips and ice cream and did part of their homework until one of their mothers came to collect them. On Saturday, she saw friends, other widows in the town, calling on them in her car. Her time was full, and often, in the week after she'd received the news of what was coming, she found that she'd forgotten briefly what it was, but never for long. Nancy Brophy asked her one day when she had called to Nancy's house if she was sure she did not want to go to the Canary Islands. "No, I'm going on as normal," Molly said. "You'll have to talk about it. The girls say you'll have to talk about it." Are they ringing you?" "They are," Nancy said. "It's the children they should be worrying about," Molly said. "Well, everyone is worried about you." "I know. They look at me wondering how to get by me quickly enough in case I might bite them, or I don't know what." The only person who came up to me at the Bridge Club was Betty Farrell, who took my arm and asked me, with them all watching, to phone her or send word or call around to her if I needed anything. She looked as if she meant it. "Some people are very good," Nancy said. "The girls are very good, Eileen and Margaret, and you'll be glad now to have them so close." "Oh, but they have their own lives now," Molly said. They sat for a while without speaking. "Well, it's an awful shock, the whole thing," Nancy continued eventually. "That's all I'll say. The whole town is shocked. Frank is the last person you would expect. You must be in a terrible state about it, Molly." "As long as it's the winter, I can manage," Molly said. I sleep late in the mornings, and I'm kept busy. It's the summer I dread. I'm not like those people who suffer from that disorder where there's no light. I dread the long summer days when I wake with the dawn and think the blackest thoughts, the blackest thoughts. But I'll be all right until then." "Oh, Lord, I must remember that," Nancy said. "I never knew that about you. Maybe we'll go away then." Would you do something for me, Nancy?" Molly said, standing up, preparing to leave. I would, of course, Molly. Would you ask people to talk to me about it? I mean, people who know me. I mean, not to be afraid to mention it." "I will, Molly. I'll do that." As they parted, Molly noticed that Nancy was close to tears. 2 days before the trial, as she was walking back to her house with the morning newspaper, Frank's car drew alongside her and stopped. She noticed a pile of parish newsletters on the back seat. She got into the front passenger seat without looking at him. "You're out early," he said. "I'm just up. I go out and get the paper before I do anything. It's a bit of exercise." When they reached the house, he parked the car and they both walked into the kitchen. "You've had your breakfast, I'd say," she said. "I have," he replied. He was not wearing his priest's collar. "Well, you can look at the paper now while I make toast and a cup of tea." He sat in the armchair in the corner, and she could hear him fold and unfold the pages of the newspaper as she moved around the kitchen. When the toast and tea were ready, she set them out on the table with a cup and saucer for each of them. "Father Greenwood said he was down." Frank said he was, she replied. "He says you're a lesson to everyone of your age, out every night." "Well, as you know, I keep myself busy." "That's good." She realized that she'd forgotten to put butter on the table. She went to the fridge to fetch some. "The girls are in and out to see you?" he asked. "If I need them, I know where they are." He watched her, spreading the butter on the toast. We thought you might go away for a bit of a holiday," he said. She reached over for the marmalade and said nothing. Do you know it would spare you?" So the girl said. She did not want the silence that began to linger then for too long. Yet everything she thought of saying seemed unnecessary. She wished he would go. I'm sorry I didn't come in and tell you myself what was happening," he said. "Well, you're here now, and it's nice to see you," she replied. "I think it's going to be..." He didn't finish, merely lowered his head. She did not drink the tea or eat the toast. There might be a lot of detail in the papers, he said. I just wanted to warn you myself about that. Don't worry about me at all, Frank, she said. She tried to smile in case he looked up. It's been bad, he said, and shook his head. She wondered if they would let him say Mass when he was in prison, or have his vestments and his prayer books. We'll do the best we can for you, Frank, she said. What do you mean? He asked. When he lifted his head and took her in with a glance, he had the face of a small boy. I mean, whatever we can do, we will do. And none of us will be going away. I'll be here. Are you sure you don't want to go away? He asked in a half-whisper. I am certain, Frank. He did not move. She put her hand on the cup. The tea was still hot. Frank smiled faintly and then stood up. I wanted to come in anyway and see you, he said. I'm glad you did, she said. She did not stand up from her chair until she heard him starting the car in the drive. She went to the window and watched him reversing and turning the car, careful as always not to drive on her lawn. She stood at the window as he drove away. She stayed there until the sound of his car had died down in the distance. So I don't know how much time we have, but if anybody has anything they want to ask, then if you want to do that, if we have time, we can do that. It's a bit. I know it's a bit hard, but anyway, I'll turn my back for a minute, pretend I'm not here or something. Yes, thank you. This is about James Joyce. Had he ever read Chekhov? I think one of the interesting things about Chekhov that he comes to us slightly like Freud comes to us. That Auden said about Freud that he wasn't really a person as much as a climate of opinion. And so this sort of helps to explain how in certain novels Henry James seems to be following some sort of. It looks as though he's formulating in his novels a drama that Freud is formulating in his theories, but he hadn't read Freud. And I wonder if with Chekhov it's the same, that at a certain time that business of allowing silence to stand for more than statement stands for, to allow a set of tiny longings to fill the page, that element that Chekhov was working with in the stories and the plays made its way into the air, or was part of the air, or was some way or other that people were dealing with, say, a way out of Victorian literature or of Gothic literature. And that irrespective of whether Joyce read him or not, that he would have seen enough other work that was close to that. And there are even moments in Ibsen, who Joyce knew very well, and that actually are sort of working with the same ideas, even though Ibsen is always working with larger ideas, I think much to his discredit at certain points. But it's funny about influence and how influence works, because you can often find that somebody can be deeply influenced by someone they haven't read, because that is making its way into work that's everywhere suddenly. And that Chekhovian principle, certainly by the time that Joyce was writing, say, the last story, of the very uncomfortable, almost existential figure of Gabriel in The Dead. You feel that he actually, has he been reading Camus? You know what I mean? In other words, that it's very strange. Sorry, it's very strange how all that sort of thing develops. You know, that how something gets into the air, So I think there are other examples of that where you can find that even though somebody didn't read somebody, that sort of is there. Yeah. Yeah, that somehow the zeitgeist of silence surrounding strong emotion rather than screaming, things being repressed, things being withheld, that all of that is in the air in these years and is being used by everybody in one way or another. Something like that. Did everybody hear the question? Yeah, I mean, there's a really awful passage where James comes back to New York in the early years of the 20th century, and he really hates what has been done to the village that he spent those 5 years in between the ages of 7 and 12, which was essentially when New York was the area around Washington Square and south of it. He hates the skyscrapers, he hates the avenues, he cannot believe that these people are so unimaginative that they call their avenues after numbers. He thinks it's the strangest thing ever. He cannot believe that some great architect wasn't brought in. It would have brought the great avenues east-west, where the sea light could have been used to beautiful effect. He cannot believe that people who are rich are interested in showing off their wealth, whereas in Italy, where he has been living or spending a lot of time, and indeed in England, there's a sense of people who are very wealthy keeping it down. And everything he sees appalls him. And in the middle of all this, he goes down and gets shown the tenements. And he gets shown where the Irish are living. And he gets shown where the Jewish immigrants are living. And where the Italians are living. And he really has nothing good to say about all three groups. And when you read it, you realize something very stingy is biting Henry James as he watches this scene. But that, obviously, if you're a Jewish Italian or from post-famine Irish immigrants, then it makes for odd reading. His relationship with Ireland is interesting. He said about his sister Alice when she died, Alice is so strange. We've always been trying to define her. She was the smartest person of the age in many ways, and the most difficult, and the funniest, and the best company. But you know what I think about her in the end? He wrote to his brother William, she was an Irish woman. That's who she was. And he said it meaning that she had a certain spirit, that he saw a rebellious spirit, a certain eloquence, and she was an Irish woman. His brother William certainly had supported the Irish cause, during these years. Now, by this time, Henry James is ensconced in London, and it's really very hard to explain to a Duchess about Irish Presbyterianism. Because Duchesses knew there were the poor Irish and the rich Irish. And which are you, darling? And the problem with James was to explain that his grandfather was the second richest man in New York State after Mr. Astor when he died. But that his grandfather had in fact come from Baileyburg, County Cavan as an Irish Presbyterian, and he was the Duke of Nowhere. And so even in his later memoirs, James invents English ancestors, which he doesn't have. And so this is really about someone's utter self-transformation. The only moment where he talks about himself as Celtic, and it's a comic moment, it's a wonderful moment, where I hesitate to say he falls in love, but he forms a strong attachment with, that's a nicer way of putting it, isn't it, with Lady Gregory's nephew, who's called Jocelyn Perce. And everybody who knew Jocelyn loved Jocelyn. He had no intelligence very much, but he was very good looking. And as a result, he didn't tax Henry James's mind in any way, but he loved hanging out with him. And there's a letter to Jocelyn where he says, since we're both Celtic, we both something. And so, in other words, love brought him close to being Celtic for a brief sentence. Snobbery brought him away from being Celtic for many, many years. And in the middle, then, peppered throughout the work, are stray references to Ireland and the Irish cause in letters and in bits of the novels. And then suddenly you discover when the London Times publishes a forged letter to say that Parnell is in fact a terrorist, and Parnell is a member of Parliament, there's a parliamentary inquiry into this, and Parnell is in effect on trial. And what's astonishing about this trial is who's sitting watching. Lady Gregory is there. Oscar Wilde's brother is reporting on the trial for the Daily Telegraph, and Wilde often goes with him. And in the middle of the whole thing, who else is there every day? And has to queue to get in? Henry James is there. And it's an interesting business of James, even James saying that the Emmet rebellion was a noble moment. So that this comes strangely, as almost everything about James comes wrapped in ambiguity. He loved his family, and he got away from them as quickly as he could, and he stayed away from them. He was essentially homosexual, but his best friends were women. He was neither American nor English. He loved company. He went out every night, but he longed for solitude. And everything you say about him, the opposite is there. But with his view of the Irish thing is something very simple, that his grandfather dies in 1833, and on his gravestone is written, William James of Albany and Ireland. And he was the second richest man in New York State. After 1847, people like him who were of Presbyterian origin viewed the Irish who arrived, the desperately poor Irish, as not being their relatives or not being their compatriots. A great division grew among the Irish Presbyterians about the Ulster, mainly Ulster Presbyterians, about their own Irish background. And as Ireland made its way then throughout the disastrous second half of the 19th century into independence, these people were almost excluded from Irish America, as it began to be called. And they were excluded, much to their own delight and glee, from this. And James's snaky position in all of this is an interesting example of it, and there are many, many others. So that I think that it's almost like that almost in every area to do with the past, where we feel it impinges on us, and it hits us deeply over a figure we might admire who made statements we don't admire. That it isn't just a simple question of trying to airbrush the statements to love the work, but almost to see how possibly this got done. That the nuances surrounding James's peculiar ambiguity in relation to his Irishness, which was mainly hostility, but it was hostility in a very interesting context. And it's almost, I mean, in other words, you still have to say, don't you, that the sentences he wrote sometimes were so wonderful, the observations, and his interest in and his delight in the strange treacheries of the human heart, that those were something that belonged to him. He didn't just make it up. It was in him, but it was in him before he sent it out. And so almost through that, we can learn to both, read him in other words, read him quite happily in Enniscorthy. But it is an interesting question, and it's a question that won't go away.
I guess my question is about emigration as well. pulling away from it. And I find that in, of course, in Molly and Frank as well. And I'm wondering if you just feel that it's just part of the human condition to want to find connection, and at the same time to be caught on it, and yet just to feel in the end that perhaps just being there is enough. I think in the Henry James character, it becomes redemptive in his art, perhaps, that it will become the basis for his observation and for the richness of the ambivalence that he permeates his knowledge with. But you don't really see that in an ordinary person like Molly. All you see is sort of the bleakness that she's left with, and yet she's still able to offer Frank just her mere presence. And I'm wondering if you think that enough just to be there, or...
Yeah, this is a question about people being emotionally connected and emotionally withdrawn and how that works. I think the first thing that I have to say about it is that Henry James, I think, gave writers the best advice. It's just two words: dramatize, dramatize. In other words, for me, there's a great drama in that idea that she's his mother. That if this were, I mean, I don't want to be rude about Brazilian soap operas, but if this was a Brazilian soap opera, she would scream him for an hour, and they would end up, kissing and making up and declaring eternal love. If this was an opera, if this was, if they were on certain programs on American television, there would be tremendously fun. But that if you realize that is what the material is, and the reader knows that, what those emotions would have to be, don't declare them, don't put them in, leave them more or less unspoken. And have every word she says in that last confrontation that it can be read two ways. It can be read as her interest in making him feel loved and her interest in saying absolutely nothing to him that means anything. And that you play with that. But, it's almost, it is a manipulation of the material rather than something I have to say about how people should live. Because I think if you want to start saying how people should live, you should really join the priesthood, or become a psychiatrist, or enter into some other profession whereby you can set down a blueprint for how life should be conducted. But if you're on the other side, and I do view what I do as the other side of that, you're watching for the flaw, you're watching for the moment, and you're using parts of yourself and other people, but you're also just in every story watching, is there a moment I can come in here to show something, just to show it and to dramatize it and to get the conflict to work and to leave it at that. So that when the reader puts down the book, the reader doesn't know in the end. Now, why people should want to write this or read it, I don't know, because obviously you'd be better off reading sermons and, seeing a shrink. But nonetheless, that business of somebody trying to work out, to tease out what something looked like or felt like without, and also playing with ideas of sympathy so that you're not sure who you have sympathy for, and playing with ideas of endings so you're not sure how it ends, and playing with the idea of villain so you're not sure who's the villain, and that you're just working all the time at making that softer and more nuanced than it might seem otherwise. Maybe the best description of it is where there's a Catalan poet talks about life being a movie that's been shown, but the room is bright. And your job is to try and darken the room, even if for just a second, so that for 1 second you can actually see the movie clearly. And then someone turns on the lights again or pulls up the blinds again. But it's something like that. But it doesn't have a moral prescription within it. Although, of course, just trying to get it down truthfully. So that, you get a sentence in that like that she forgets that she often forgets about it. But then you think to yourself, hold on a minute, that's not exactly truthful there. She wouldn't forget it for long. In other words, something would happen during the week to distract her. And for a second she'd forget, or a moment. But to try and get to truthfully how that emotion would be, but just add, but never for long. And then with never for long, you're getting a sound, I don't know what that is, never for long, that hits the reader's nervous system. Meaning, you don't have to say, every moment of every day she woke every morning. You don't have to go on, you just have to say never for long. And if you can get the never for long down right, then you might get the emotion of what that week would have been like for somebody. So something like that. But it's a difficult business. Yes, sir?
The argument
the relationship between the priest and the mother. I think things were much more various than that. I have a mother in the Blackwater Lightship in my novel whose daughter wanted to be a nun, and she had only one child, and she was utterly horrified at the idea, and she did everything to stop her. And that certainly there were, that the mother's authority in the house tended to come from her way of handling religion, and so therefore a very sensitive boy under those conditions would very easily think, well, this is how I will best please her, is if I become a priest. But, I think if you look at the percentage, you look at how that fractured, what's happening now is that if you're dying, you're still calling for the priest, and he's still coming. In other words, to say that there's been a complete collapse of the church isn't actually true, that people are still getting married in churches. I think the figures for people getting married in registry offices is quite low. Among the Catholic population, which is the majority of the South, and the same goes for baptisms, and the same goes for it's hard to have a funeral in a registry office. And so that the church remains strangely there, not only in the background, but in the foreground under certain conditions. And I think if you ask people in Ireland the same, if you could formulate the question properly. I remember when I worked for a newspaper and they were trying to work out, a questionnaire about gay marriage, presuming that everyone would be against it. This is about 15 years ago. I just waited my turn because we were all doing the questions, and the question is the crucial thing. And the question I sneaked into the questionnaire was, if your daughter or son were getting married, and it was a same-sex marriage, and you were invited to the party afterwards, would you go? And the majority, of course, would go. I said, well, come on, disapprove or don't disapprove isn't the issue then, is it? And so it's what question you ask. And I think if you asked very fundamental questions about faith, afterlife, things like that, God, that you would get the same questions, answers very much now as you would 50 years ago. So I'm interested in that level of continuity that goes under all this loss of authority that the church has had, but that underneath things are still very interesting in their continuity. But I could be wrong about that. We'd have to formulate the questions, but it'd be worth doing at some point. Yeah. So this is, I'm told here this is the last question, so we have to. Did everyone hear that question? It's a really difficult form. And anyone can write a novel. And, you just start at the beginning, you tell the whole story, and then it's over. And, it takes ages. But, there it is. It's also very difficult to write a poem. How do you start a poem, and where should the poem end? What should be in the middle of a poem? It's tough, a poem. And so I started, when I was a teenager, trying to write poetry. And that failed me completely, and in no uncertain terms. And then I started writing short stories, and they were no good either. And it was only, when I was, in my mid-20s and got an idea for a novel and I worked on it, that I could actually handle material that other people seemed to think was okay. So I just simply didn't write anything because I thought I couldn't. And I went back to it with that story. That was the first one. Just that picture of that's really in 5 scenes, the opening where he visits her, the next scene where she goes to see the library, then she goes to her sister-in-law, then he comes to see her again, so 6 scenes, and then the daughters come, and then her son comes. Just write down 6 scenes, and just write them. And so it came to me, once I read that, I thought, I left it for a good while, and thought, well, that's okay. And then I started some others, but it's hard. you have to get an opening image before you can begin. So that thing about the socks isn't just a sort of joke. I mean it, that you have to almost see an opening where there are two people in a room and one of them is pulling up one sock and then the other sock. Whereas with a novel, you can begin it in a much more straightforward way without an actual image. So it's funny. It's hard. Okay. Thank you very much.